Hello and welcome back to The Critique. Today we are sharpening the editorial focus on a transcript from a video interview.
Right. It features a host and a guest, Rebecca Antet, and they're talking about the rise of anti-Semitism, the American church, and her own theological journey.
The subject matter is incredibly heavy. The title they went with is Jew Hatred is Taking Over the American Church.
Yeah, that's a title that promises high-stakes, immediate conflict. So let's see if the structure, actually delivers on that aggressive promise.
Okay, so immediate engagement is the name of the game here. And right out of the gate, I feel the pacing of the opening works against the content. The interview's opening segment, what the host calls a soft introduction. It just delays the narrative hook and really dilutes the urgency of it all.
It really does. It's almost a bait and switch. You have this headline that's, screaming about a crisis, about hatred.
Right.
And the text begins with this very long, very gentle warm-up lap. The weakness here is that the host spends so much time establishing rapport.
Talking about the daughter, Eden, the root of the tree metaphor.
Exactly. And then it's a standard chronological biography. We're hearing about Sister Sandra Marquez and, Sunday school and flannel graphs.
And look, while that builds warmth and it establishes the guest as a normal person, it completely buries the lead.
Completely.
This guest has a compelling, high-stakes story. She was in Jerusalem during the October 7th attack. She has staff there. She's talking about the fear of home invasion now that she's back in the U.S.
That's gripping material. Terrifying stuff.
But the listener has to wade through 10 minutes of childhood anecdotes to get there. By the time we even get to the crisis, you might have lost the people who clicked for the headline.
Yeah, I think it comes down to trusting your audience. The host feels this need to justify why we're listening to her by starting at her birth.
So the suggestion here is to restructure.
Just restructure the timeline. Start in media res. You have to open with the central conflict, the current crisis, and then flash back to the biography later.
To explain why she's the one qualified to speak on it.
It's a cinematic approach, not a chronological one.
Okay, so let's get concrete. How do we actually strengthen this? Instead of the host starting with, how did you grow up and getting the flannel graph story?
Right.
What if the interview opened with her quote about the worst stories from pre-Holocaust happening here in the United States?
That hits you right in the chest. Or building on that, what about the part where she mentions the WhatsApp group?
Oh, yeah.
She says, we have a WhatsApp group for our staff, and every day there's at least one attack. That's immediate. It's terrifying.
So the host could open with, Rebecca, you told me your staff gets notifications every single day about attacks against Jews right here in America.
And boom, you have instant engagement. You're delivering on the title's promise from second one.
It changes the energy entirely. And it's a simple edit, just reordering. You can take that Psalm 122.6 calling story, which is a great part of her arc.
And just move it to the middle as a flashback.
Yeah. Open the interview with her return to the U.S. post-October 7th. She talks about coming back to a different church in a different church.
Exactly. That immediately hooks you with the stakes of the Jew hatred from the title. It creates a mystery.
I came back to a different church.
Right. Now the listener's asking, why? What changed? Is my church different? But I was a church kid just makes them think, okay, so was I. And they tune out.
It forces them to lean in, not lean back. You want them asking questions. Okay, let's move on. The second critique, audience alignment.
This is so crucial for a topic this specific. The dialogue, it relies really heavily on a theological shorthand that might, alienate or confuse anyone not already deep in this niche.
I noticed that all through the transcript, it feels like a conversation happening inside a bubble. The weakness is that it's constantly using terms like replacement theology, Gentile nation, and even specific references like Bridges for Peace.
Or Experiencing God by Blackaby.
Without ever pausing to define them, to explain why they matter.
Right. The guest says she realized she'd preached that Israel is talking to the church, and she frames it as this huge error. But for a casual listener, even another Christian, that might sound normal.
It might sound like standard doctrine.
Yeah.
They might not get why it's so controversial, or why she feels like she has to repent for it. It assumes a level of theological knowledge that really limits the audience.
And the host just nods along, doesn't unpack it. It creates this insider club feel.
Which is the opposite of what you want. So the suggestion is to incorporate bridge questions. The interviewer has to consciously play the role of the layperson, clarify these terms so the argument's accessible.
It's about being a translator. The host might know exactly what she means, but he's got to advocate for the person listening in their car.
Okay, an example. When she mentions replacement theology.
Or even just the concept of it.
Right. The host should just pause and ask, for those listening who maybe grew up with that same teaching, can you define what that theology is and why you now see it as dangerous?
That's a great way to frame it. It doesn't make the host look ignorant. It makes him look like a good facilitator. He's inviting her to teach, not just, reminisce.
Another one is when they discuss the Gentile nation. The guest says, if you're a believer, you can't miss Israel. And the host is just an echo chamber there.
Yeah, he just agrees.
Instead, he could ask, what does that look like for a Gentile believer to not miss Israel in their daily walk? Does it mean praying, giving money, visiting?
Exactly. Turn the abstract theology into concrete action. There's another moment where she mentions the Hebrew roots movement and people blowing shofars at weird times.
That's such a fascinating visual and a little funny.
It is, but it's just dismissed. A bridge question there could be, so how does someone support Israel without, falling into what you called the goofiness of appropriating those traditions?
That anchors it in reality. It stops the listener from feeling stupid or excluded. Okay, so this brings us to the dynamic between the speakers, our third critique point, host-guest balance.
This was the area that, for me, really caused the most friction in the flow of the transcript. The interviewer's tendency to insert these long autobiographical monologues. It just interrupts the guest's momentum. And the irony is...
Oh, the irony is thick.
So thick, it ironically mirrors the very me-centered culture they're critiquing.
It's palpable. I mean, the weakness is so clear. There are these moments where the guest is building to a really profound emotional point. She talks about the stripping away of her ministry, losing her business, the loss of her pregnancy.
She says darkness after darkness. It's a vulnerable, heavy moment. The audience is leaning in, feeling empathy.
And then the host jumps in.
And he doesn't just jump in with a wow or a follow-up question. He jumps in with this lengthy story about his own political shift, his social currency, his conservative values.
He talks about breaking away from leftist ideology because he's a young black man in California.
And look, that's his story. And it's a valid one, but in this context, it halts her narrative flow completely.
It feels like a competition for suffering or significance, not an interview. She's talking about divine redirection through tragedy, and he pivots to his political-social dynamic. It just takes all the air out of it.
Right. It shifts the focus from the expert guest back to the host. So the suggestion here is pretty straightforward. Tighten the interviewer's contributions.
Make them strictly about asking questions or affirming her point.
Exactly. Reserve the personal anecdotes for another time or shorten them way, way down. The host's job is to make the guest shine, not reflect her light back onto himself.
So a concrete edit. In that specific moment, after she describes the dark, the actionable edit is for the host to just cut his monologue about his rebellion entirely. Instead of that, he asks a direct question, something like, you mentioned stripping away the good to get to the best. How do you distinguish between a tragic failure and a divine redirection when you're in the middle of that darkness?
That is so much stronger. It keeps the focus on her wisdom, which is why we're listening. It lets her expand on the theology of suffering instead of having to nod politely through his political awakening.
And there's another moment later on with the me-centered irony. The guest is critiquing the me-centered gospel, how Christianity has become about gratify myself.
She's making a powerful point about avocado toast Christianity.
And the host jumps in to talk about girl boss culture and his own following. He says, truth be told, that's actually the space I came from. A lot of my following was built in that.
It validates her point, sure, but it centers him again. It's like he's saying, yes, let's talk about that, but through the lens of my career.
Right. So the suggestion is to just remove that self-reference. Let her powerful point stand on its own. The listener doesn't need to know his follower demographics to get the critique.
Agreed. It dilutes the impact. And honestly, it weakens his authority. It makes him seem like he needs to keep asserting his relevance.
Okay, so moving to our fourth and final point, let's look at the narrative arc and, the so what.
Yeah, this is about how we land the plane. The interview identifies a massive problem, apathy, anti-Semitism in the church. But the call to action feels a little scattered.
It does. It's scattered between spiritual abstractness and very practical safety concerns.
The weakness is that it jumps between solutions. On one hand, it's read the Bible, salvation. And on the other, it's security for synagogues and the Stand Against Fear initiative.
And so the ending feels disjointed. It pivots to this standard gospel presentation, there is one way to God. instead of addressing the specific crisis they raised.
Which is how to equip the church to handle what they called the goat nation trajectory.
Yeah, they spend 40 minutes convincing us the house is on fire.
But the closing doesn't quite hand the listener a fire extinguisher. So the suggestion is to synthesize the spiritual and the practical into one cohesive closing argument that's really aimed at the listener, a pastor, a layperson who is terrified by all this.
So how do we fix that? What if we look at it from the perspective of that Stand Against Fear initiative? The guest mentions it for May 15th and the Night of Hope, but they're kind of buried in the middle of the text.
So the concrete example for improvement is to structure the whole outro around those actionable items. Instead of a general salvation call, which, let's be honest, the audience for this channel has probably already heard.
Right.
That's powerful. It forces a specific script. It gives the listener something to write down and take to their leadership.
And you can connect the dots back to the beginning, especially with our edited structure. You can link that flannel graph innocence from her biography to the fear of home invasion reality she's living now.
Oh, that's good. You ask her to reconcile how the Jesus of the flannel graph equips you for a world where people are ramming into synagogues.
It creates a narrative loop. It resolves the tension. It admits the Sunday school version of faith might not be enough for this moment and asks, so what is? The current ending, where the host asks for a message and gets a standard, Jesus loves you, it feels like a missed opportunity.
Especially given the context.
The listener leaves feeling spiritually affirmed, maybe, but practically unarmed against the specific threat they just spent an hour hearing about. It's about fulfilling the promise of the title.
Absolutely. If the title is about hatred taking over, the conclusion needs to be the battle plan. It moves the piece from just being informative to being transformative.
You want the listener to turn it off and do something different.
A generic ending, while theologically sound for them, is just narratively weak for this topic.
So let's recap the main critiques. First, reorder the timeline. Move the soft introduction and childhood stories and start with the high-stakes conflict of post-October 7th.
Match the urgency of your title. Don't bore us with biography when there's a crisis.
Second, define your terms. The host needs to be a bridge for the audience, clarifying jargon like replacement theology, so the message is accessible.
Don't let the guest speak a foreign language, even if you understand it.
Third, that host-guest balance. The host needs to discipline their personal anecdotes. Interrupting a story of tragedy with your own political theory it doesn't work. Keep the spotlight on the guest.
And finally, sharpen the so what. The conclusion needs to synthesize the spiritual and practical and offer a specific mandate, a toolkit, not a generic sign-off.
Give them a weapon, not just a wave.
Yeah.
To the listener who sent this in, you have incredible raw material. The guest is articulate, passionate, the stakes couldn't be higher. This is a serious discussion.
For sure.
By tightening the structure and focusing on the audience's journey instead of the host's, you can turn this from a casual chat into a really compelling and important piece of media.
We'd invite you to apply these edits, maybe try a recut or use these ideas for your next interview script, and send the work back to us for a follow-up. We would love to see how it turns out.
Until next time, keep refining your work.